The question is, what does a food fight among art historians about late Renaissance painting have to do with the disruptive changes in the nature of technological innovation? That's the question we're going to answer. And to start, I want to sort of go back to about the year 1400. This is a painting from that period, and as you'll see, throughout really most of the Middle Ages, this was kind of the nature of art. Painting was very flat, it was very one-dimensional, more symbolic really than anything else. And then something very strange happened about the year 1420. Painting changed dramatically, all art changed dramatically, and what you started to see was paintings becoming much more realistic. The scenes were more realistic, you had perspective, you had dimensionality, and this applied to still lifes, to landscapes, to portraits. And there were sort of these long period of successive big improvements in the realism of painting that lasted really up until the sort of the modernist period in the 1800s with the Impressionists and people who went a different direction. And in fact, this period starting in 1420 has been referred to by the artist David Hockney, the contemporary artist David Hockney, as a period of photorealism. And I'll just show you a couple of examples of this. So that was 1400 I showed you before. This is Da Vinci, 1500. You can see quite a dramatic difference. This is Vermeer, his painting The Music Lesson from about 1660. And remember this one because we're going to come back to that particular picture in a moment. And then even up until the 1800s with Ingres, the French portrait artist, you can see a tremendous amount of realism. Now, as I said a moment ago, Hockney referred to this as photorealism, but that's a very odd thing to say because, of course, the camera wasn't actually invented until the 1800s. Or was it? Well, it turns out Hockney has a theory. About 10 years ago, he wrote a book called Secret Knowledge, and he postulated that, in fact, the master, starting around 1420, had invented a series of camera-like devices that they used to improve and create new ways of painting, new ways of drawing. And this has been an extremely controversial book. For the last 10 years, it's really divided art historians in the art world as to whether this is true. Of course, some people say, I know, what he's really saying is they all cheated or somehow they were using technology in a way that was, sort of takes away from our romantic view about the Renaissance and these painters in their garrets struggling away. But Hockney went through a lot of research and he said, there was a major kind of event around this period of 1420. There was a separate technological development, which was the mania for telescopes and also for spectacles. And this meant that as those technologies improved, there was kind of a marketplace of kind of off-the-shelf prisms and lenses and mirrors that could be purchased relatively cheaply and put to other kinds of uses. And indeed, Hockney argues that in fact what the Renaissance painters did was they took those technologies and they put them to use to improve their work. This is an example of a device called the Camera Obscura. It was originally invented for astronomical observations. It's one way of, for example, looking at a solar eclipse safely. But he said that what happened in the Renaissance was that painters and artists used this device and others like it to, in some sense, marry technology with art and to use that technology to improve it. So it kind of projects, as you'll see in the picture, it projects an image of what the scene is outside, upside down on the canvas, and then the painter can use that to trace, to get the perspective right, to get the colors right, and so on. And that this really, he said, is what explains that dramatic, revolutionary break in art between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, indeed, what defines the Renaissance itself. Now, a man named Tim Jennison has been trying to prove Hockney's theory in a very unusual way. And Jennison is a hardware, software engineer. He has no artistic training whatsoever. He decided that one way to prove this theory was to reconstruct Vermeer's Camera Obscura, the way Hockney imagined it was to do, and not only to reconstruct the device itself, but actually to reconstruct the scene of that painting I showed you, The Music Lesson. So he had a barn, and it actually, just the orientation of it was perfect, so that the light coming into the barn, he did a lot of research, and he's working on this for years. He determined that the lighting of his barn was pretty close to the lighting in Delft, where Vermeer was painting. And so he reconstructed the entire scene of that painting. And then over the course of several years, working, he says, a couple hours a day, he has been systematically using this camera obscura that he built to recreate the music lesson. This work will be the subject of a documentary that's coming out sometime next year that's been produced by the magicians Penn and Teller, so you'll get a much better sense of how this happened. But again, this is a man who had no training in art whatsoever, had no experience as a painter, and after several years, this is what he came up with. Right? Now, remember, he is not copying the Vermeer painting. He didn't have a copy of the painting itself. He had what he imagined Vermeer was looking at and the device through which Vermeer was looking at it, and he recreated essentially the process. And so the picture itself does not exactly match the Vermeer picture, but the similarity and the quality is so extraordinary. I think it really goes a tremendously far way to prove that Hockney was right, that the old masters were in fact using these lenses, these cameras, these prisms as a way of improving their work and getting the kind of realism that we had around about that time. Now, this year, two art academics, Pablo Garcia and Golan Levin, decided they had another way they wanted to try and prove the Hockney theory. And this gets to the nature of what we call Big Bang disruption. There was another device that came about in the 1800s called the Camera Lucida. It's a much more simple device, but it can be used indoors or outdoors without any special boxes or any other kind of equipment around it. It's essentially just a prism on a stick. But if you attach it and look down through it, it gives the illusion of projecting onto the blank page the scene that you're actually looking at. So it's an excellent way for tracing the scene you're looking at, even, as I say, in daylight. The problem was that the Camera Lucida disappeared about 100 years ago. At one time, everybody had them. They were very popular, but they disappeared. And one of the things that the two academics decided they would do is that they would recreate, they would bring back the Camera Lucida, get as many people as they could to use it as a way of demonstrating just how technology and art worked together during the Renaissance and why, in fact, the theory is not so controversial, not so hostile as many believe it did. So, of course, what they did was they launched a Kickstarter project in the summer, and they said, look, we went out, we sourced all off-the-shelf components, the prisms, the gooseneck, the clamp, everything. They found the component parts, and they found sources using the internet globally to find people who would manufacture it, who would distribute it for them, and they launched a Kickstarter project saying, we just want to rebuild this thing. Now, if you know anything about business, you would imagine that this would be a complete failure. Right? Here's two academics, they have no business experience whatsoever, they're launching a project to make something, they don't know anything about manufacturing, they don't have any inventory, they don't have any parts, they don't have a distribution network, they have no funding whatsoever, and in fact they don't even want to make a profit. What they said was once this experiment was complete, all they were going to do was give away, they open sourced the specs, they open sourced all the context that they had for it, and said once this is over, anyone who wants to make these commercially, great, go ahead and do it. And what happens next is what we call a Big Bang disruption. And it's the kind of new approach to innovation, new approach to product development that we saw in a research project my colleagues at Accenture and I have been doing for the last 2 years. We've seen examples like this in about 30 different industry segments over the last couple of years. So even though we're talking about art here, in a moment we'll shift and talk about business. All right, so you can guess what the result was. They were looking for about $15,000. Instead, they got about 15,000 backers. And instead of raising $15,000, they raised almost $500,000. They added 2 more production runs, and then they finally said, enough. This was over the course of a few weeks. They said, we've now pre-sold 10,000 units, $30 a piece, and this is all we want to do. This is really all we're capable of doing. After this, it's going to have to be somebody who wants to do it commercially, and they've said they're going to name some companies that will do it commercially for them starting next year. The odd thing about the product, which they call the Neo Lucida, is it is considerably better than the version of the Camera Lucida you could have bought in the 1800s. The parts are better, it's flexible, all these other things, it's better. And yet, they were selling it for, you could get it for a donation of $30, which is dramatically cheaper than what you would have actually paid in the 1800s, in 1800s dollars, for an inferior version of the camera Lucida. So this strikes us as something really odd and really scary. Again, we're talking about art here, but it has a much bigger impact going to business. And let's talk about that. So what does this mean? How does this affect anything? Well, those of you who know anything about technology diffusion, there's a long-standing theory. It's been going on for decades, based on a seminal work by a man named Everett Rogers. And he said that the way new technologies enter the market and go sort of through their paces is through a kind of this bell curve life cycle. And he said, you can find more or less 5 distinct stages of market penetration, market diffusion for new technologies. You start with the innovators and early adopters, and then you get the mainstream markets, and then finally at the end you get the laggards.